A top Iranian military official claims Israel used, quote, electronic devices to remotely kill Iran's top nuclear scientist. Israel has declined to comment on the death of Mohsen Fakhrizadeh. He was considered by Western countries as the leader of Iran's nuclear program, which he founded 2 decades ago. The attack happened near Iran's capital city of Tehran on Friday. Iranian TV reported today that a weapon recovered from the scene has specifications matching those from the Israeli military. The Trump administration pulled out, of course, of the Iran nuclear deal back in 2018. Under the accord, Iran agreed to limit nuclear activities and allow in inspectors in exchange for the lifting of sanctions. Joining us now to talk about how this could affect President-elect Joe Biden's attempt to re-sign that deal is Trita Parsi. He's Executive Vice President of Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft there in D.C. Parsi was born in Iran before moving west as a child. He got his Ph.D. in foreign policy at Johns Hopkins. Thank you so much for being with us, sir. We certainly appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.
And we need your expertise right now. First off, briefly just explain why this scientist was such a high-profile target.
Well, he was obviously a very important person within the nuclear program. He was not the founder of it. The Iranian nuclear program goes back several decades. He actually got started during the time of the Shah with the help and active assistance of the United States. He is obviously critical in many different ways, but at the same time, the nuclear program in Iran is so advanced, so there's no single individual that would be decisive to it. And all of the previous assassinations that Israel has conducted against Iranian scientists have perhaps temporarily set back the program, but have not in any way, shape, or form changed the trajectory of the program. The only thing that actually has changed the trajectory of the program has been the nuclear deal that Obama signed with Iran in 2015.
And I know you were involved in that, and you're a big proponent of that deal. I'll get to that in just a second. But I did want to mention this idea that Iran now blaming Israel. Is there concrete evidence, and what is Israel saying?
The Israelis are denying, but then again, Israel always denies any such involvement. It's not part of Israeli policy to take public credit for any things of this kind. Israeli officials have, however, on background, informed the New York Times that Israel was behind it and argued that this was something that was necessary to do. There's really little doubt that Israel is the main suspect here, because at the end of the day, the number of countries that have the motivation, the political intent, and most importantly, the capacity to pull this off is really short. It's just the United States and Israel. No more other countries have the combination of those things.
Do you think the U.S. was involved?
I think it's very likely that the United States, the Trump administration, either gave a green light or potentially some degree of support. I don't think the United States was more involved in that. I don't think the Netanyahu government would have done this without having some tacit approval from the Trump administration.
Politically speaking, we are in the middle of this transition here in the U.S., as you know. What does this mean potentially for, when he's president, Joe Biden's efforts to rejoin that nuclear deal that Trump pulled the country out of a few years ago? I would imagine this makes things awfully complicated.
It certainly has the risk of making it very complicated, particularly if the Iranians decide to respond in kind, because then we're potentially looking at a war in the region, and that will certainly make it more difficult. And the reality is that most likely this was the intent of the Netanyahu government. These assassinations don't have that much of an impact on the nuclear program. They do, however, have a significant impact on the likelihood of diplomacy. So in some ways, the real target here was Biden's diplomacy. And it's a question mark for the future of U.S.-Israeli relations that the Israeli prime minister would do such a thing against Joe Biden even before Joe Biden has had a chance of take the oath on becoming president of the United States.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because certainly one dynamic here is U.S.-Iran relations, which have been rocky. There were reports a few weeks ago that President Trump reportedly wanted to bomb one of their facilities before leaving office, but it was talked out of it by his advisors. Now we have the killing of this scientist. But if Israel was involved and perhaps got a wink and a nod from the U.S. to do this, what does that say about the state of Israeli-American relations with President-elect Biden coming in to office?
I think that's actually really the most important question right now, because I think Netanyahu, as I mentioned, probably felt that he had some sort of a tacit green light from the Trump administration, but he probably also calculated that Joe Biden would not have the political will of imposing a cost on Netanyahu for doing this deliberate thing to sabotage Biden's prospects of diplomacy with Iran. And the only reason why he may have that perspective or that perception of what Biden will or will not do is because of a past history of American deference to Israel. Only Biden can change that. And I would point to a tweet sent out by John Brennan, which had a very strong condemnation and called it state-sponsored terrorism. I suspect that it had something to do with the Biden camp wanting to send a very strong signal to Netanyahu that they're going to be quite unforgiving if Netanyahu continues to sabotage prospects for Biden to be able to resolve the nuclear issue with Iran diplomatically.
We will certainly see how this all plays out. Mr. Parsi, thank you so much for your time and for your expertise tonight.
Thank you for having me.
Certainly appreciate it, sir. Thank you.
Thank you.